Thank you for taking your time to join us tonight, and we hope you leave with a better understanding of the work we do at WBEA. And I'm sure there'll be some questions, so we have planned for a question and answer period immediately after all the presentation, so we invite you to ask your questions at that time. We also want to thank our members, which consists of communities, industry, non-government organizations, various government and regulatory departments, and oil sands monitoring program for their ongoing support of the work that we do. We also want to recognize that we are in Treaty 8 territory and the treaty homeland of the Métis, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route for the Cree, Dene, and the Métis Nation. We want to acknowledge this because the work that WBEA does, including the forest health monitoring program that we'll be discussing tonight, is on traditional lands of these nations, and their input and knowledge have greatly impacted the design and success of the program. With that, I'll pass this over to our first contributor. Thank you.
Ooh, those are bright. Good evening. I'm Ken Foster. I've been working with the WBEA in various fashions since the inception of the program. And it's my role tonight to give you an introduction as to how the TEEM, Terrestrial Environmental Effects Monitoring Program, came together. Tech support. So I'll take you back to when stakeholders first got together to discuss the genesis of what became the Forest Health Monitoring Program. In the mid-90s, early 90s into the mid-90s, the government was becoming aware of a large wave of oil sands development. And one of the early applicants in that wave of development was Syncrude, who had an application before the government for an expansion to their Mildred Lake operations. They did get an approval for that operation, but that approval contained a clause that said that Syncrude would convene a multi-stakeholder body to develop and implement a forest health or an ecological monitoring program. And so the production history leading up to the convening of TEEM, it was chugging along at about 20 million cubic meters of bitumen per year. And here we are in the mid-90s and still chugging, but that wave of development did occur. And it occurred both through mining and through implementation of the new technology, the in situ recovery process, essentially increasing production from the mid-90s to now by about 7-fold, with also an increase in bitumen upgrading to a synthetic sweet crude. These production values, not surprisingly, caused some concern about environmental effects, and predominantly at the time, air emission effects, and their effect on the environment. In the mid-90s, we were seeing an increase in both emissions of both sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And although with the implementation of some flue gas desulfurization techniques and facilities in the early 2000s through mid-2000s, sulfur dioxide came down, nitrogen oxide emissions have continued to increase. Both of these contribute to acid deposition. Both of these are known to disperse widely across the region, and therefore a concern about the deposition of acidifying compounds was the primary concern of the TEEM committee. To organize ourselves and to put our efforts into an agreed upon objective, the first year was spent deriving an objective statement. That statement is to develop and operate a long-term monitoring program to detect and characterize the effects of oil sands emissions on terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, and on traditional resources, and hence on traditional resource users. This was a consensus decision. In other words, nobody disagreed with it. There were varying opinions as to some of the words, but everybody could live with this objective statement, and it has remained in effect since the mid-90s. I will say that very quickly after this objective statement came into being, the emphasis on aquatic resources was taken on by a new organization, the Regional Aquatics Monitoring Program, and so the TEEM committee backed away from that, and RAMP took on acid deposition monitoring to aquatic systems. The TEEM committee grew out of a former committee, which was more ad hoc, Regional Air Quality Coordinating Committee, and at the time of conception, the TEEM committee added several technical and scientific advisors to the program. So it was a fairly robust organization right out of the gate. A conceptual model was put together, not quite as pretty as this. Computers have come a long ways. The conceptual model takes us from industrial operations, increasing in complexity from mining through upgrading. Each of these, and actually also activities within Fort McMurray. Fort McMurray was growing very rapidly at the time, and some human activities, cars, home heating, also emit substances that can contribute to acidification. So all of these things come together in the left side of the conceptual diagram, in which we have the emissions leading to, in this case, nitrogen and sulfur emissions and base cations, which are basic in nature and neutralize deposition. Changes in air quality and changes in dispersion of dust and fine particulates, and in our case, leading to a concern of acid deposition. Our model at the time took us from deposited acid through soil chemistry, through a change in needle chemistry, through to a change in tree health and growth. And this was our endpoint that we were measuring, was a change in the forest health regionally. We recognized as well that there were other pathways that were possible, directly from air quality to needle chemistry, directly from air quality to lichen chemistry, through acid deposition to understory, vegetation understory health, or species composition. This model has been formalized, I would say, through the years, but has held fairly constant since the mid-90s. The TEEM committee then made what I thought was one of the most important decisions. They focused their efforts on this side of the conceptual model. We being humans like to think in some ways linearly from source to sink or cause to effect, so a tendency would have been to start here, pin down the emissions, pin down the dispersion, pin down the deposition, then go and look for effects. Our mathematical models at the time were fairly rudimentary. We were facing a growth in the industry, and so we thought we better get a program rolled out that monitored for change through this period of growth rather than spending our time trying to pin down what was a moving target. And so our emphasis was here in creation of the monitoring program to set the stage for evaluation of effects through that growth curve. We then needed to make some additional decisions on program design. One of the first decisions then was, what system do we monitor? We have in the region jack pine forests growing on very sandy soils that have minimal nutrition and minimal buffering capacity. Those provided a very sensitive early warning system of ecological system in which we could measure changes resulting from acid deposition. Other systems in the boreal forest, spruce, aspen, wetlands, at the time were considered to be more resilient and not subject to change. And so this was the system we chose, being what we perceived to be, and which is held up to be, the more acid sensitive in the region. We also were sensitive to trees growing in more exposed environments versus trees growing in larger stands. And the debate and discussion through the first years led us to decide to monitor within the stand interior. These are monitoring plots established within large jack pine stands. The premise being that change monitored in these plots would be indicative of broad forest change. We could have chosen as our starting point trees that were in more exposed conditions, but they would represent a very special case of exposure and effect, which we felt at the time would be difficult to extrapolate and therefore difficult to use in any kind of management or industry decision making. We wanted to start with monitoring plots across the deposition gradient. We did a little bit of preliminary modeling, and we found that the model indicated at about 75 kilometers away from what was then the core of mining development at the Syncrude-Suncor complex was about the transition from what we called a high to a low deposition environment. We then selected ecologically analogous stands, in other words, as similar as the environment has to offer us in which to do our monitoring, and we chose 5 in the farther away low deposition environment and 5 in the closer in what we defined as a higher deposition environment, recognizing that it wasn't going to be categorical like that, that it was going to be more of a gradient of deposition. This has grown. We have grown the program to 25 stand interior monitoring locations. We've gone back and reevaluated the decision to exclude trees growing at stand edges and brought those back into the program, or brought those into the program. So let's go back. This is what a stand interior monitoring plot looks like. We've chosen plots that are similar in soil structure, similar in soil chemistry, similar in understory composition, and similar in tree age, growth habit, stem density. In other words, we're trying to minimize the variability in the program so that we are able to better detect the effects of deposition. On the bottom here, we have a forest edge. There are a few places in the region where we have a stand edge facing towards the oil sands emission sources, where you have a large fetch or a large open area. The air mass mixes as it moves towards these areas, it comes to ground, and then it impinges on the forest. So the trees at a forest edge are presumed to be much more exposed than are trees within an interior. So within our early warning system, we added an earlier warning environment and have established monitoring plots in that environment. Also in the mid-90s, the Canadian Acid Rain Network early warning system was operating and being expanded. We had Canadian Forest Service representation on the TEEM committee, and they advised us that if we used these protocols, which were pretty well established, that this network would adopt and integrate with the TEEM network. And so we thought it was a really good opportunity. So we reviewed and adopted the protocols with minor tweaking to better be applicable in this region. Unfortunately, the RNews network funding was cut off shortly after, and that system died. But we've retained it. Change happens very slowly, well, quite slowly in the environment when it comes to deposition, and this is a difficult program to execute. Of the now 49 stands, 49 monitoring locations in the region, I think all but 2 are only accessible by helicopter. So this is a logistically demanding, challenging program, and given that the change occurs very slowly, monitoring every year wasn't reasonable. A 6-year interval was determined to be somewhat representative of what we felt would be the pace of change. It would align with the growth in the industry, and so that was the cycle that we chose. That's why we're here tonight. We've just completed the analysis of the third 6-year cycle, along with the data from the previous 2. It takes a long time to develop this kind of data set. The edge plots are sampled more frequently, and as Dr. Landis will be talking about with some of the supporting monitoring programs with lichens, those are on a different schedule as well. So there is a more robust monitoring program than just on a 6-year cycle. It's a dynamic environment. So we established 10 plots in 1998 and did the first intensive monitoring cycle. By 2004, 2 of those had been lost to industrial development, expansion of operating areas and new projects. 5 new plots were added, bringing the total to 13 plots in the program. In 2011, we embarked on the addition of a large number of sites to better represent the deposition gradient across the region. And we had the first of 2 major forest fires rip through the region, and we had a number of sites affected by fire. By 2013, we brought in the EDGE programs, the blue bars. By 2015, one of those was lost to development, and in 2016, the second major wildfire during the course of this program came through the region and affected a bunch of other sites. So what we have now is a blend of EDGE interior stands unaffected by fire, some affected by fire, and similarly a blend of EDGE sites not affected by fire and some affected by fire. Inclination might have been to remove those affected by fire from the program, but really this is a fire ecology. And our criteria for selecting plots included tree age, which was age since the last fire. So if we're basing a design on what is essentially the fire history, why would we then exclude burn sites from the program? Our news had a regeneration protocol that included, that contemplated the effect of fire. So recently we have just adopted that into the procedures manual, and all of the burn plots remain in the program. The distribution of sites as it stands today, it represents a large region. It's about 200 kilometers from the center in any direction, a 200-kilometer radius. And as I say, these are accessible only by helicopter with only a couple of exceptions. We think we have now spanned most of the deposition and gradient. We have looked at these large gap areas. Nature just isn't giving us jack pine sites that are amenable for inclusion in the program in these regions. This is a busy slide. So in parallel with the development of the program, the implementation and execution, operation of the Forest Health Monitoring Program, the Wood Buffalo Environmental Association, and in particular our sister committee, the Ambient Air Technical Committee, has been very active. So part of the supporting information is installation of tall towers. I'm not sure if you can see it in there, but there's a tall tower that goes above the tree canopy, and at the top is a system of passive air monitoring devices, which have been measuring since the late 90s SO2 and NO2 concentrations in the ambient air. So we're trying to work our way back to the left of that conceptual model and begin to understand what the stressor side is telling us. In 2006, we added passive monitors for ammonia and for nitric acid, which were emerging as possible contributors to acid deposition, and so we needed to get a handle on what those concentrations in air might be. In the late 2000s, we began with some actual deposition monitoring. What you see are the black collection funnels, and what's probably very hard to see is a little column attached to the bottom that's packed with an ion exchange resin. As the precipitation, whether it's rainfall or melting snow, works through the funnel and through the resin, the ions that contribute to either acidification of the environment or the neutralization of that acidification, the base cations, are captured. And these are twice a year taken and sent to the lab. So we're measuring air quality and we're measuring deposition. A large lichen sampling program, lichens are well known for their use in biomonitoring, has been operated in the region. Dr. Landis will be talking about that in some detail shortly. It's not restricted to the jack pine sites. I think I counted 400 sites, over 450 sites have been sampled for lichens since the late 90s. The Ambient Air Technical Committee has been implementing a continuous air monitoring network. These are powered stations with active sampling, powered active sampling for continuous monitoring of many of the substances that contribute to acid deposition and even beyond into human health considerations. And I think there's well in excess of 25 of these stations in the region now. We've been co-locating some of the passive devices and some of the ion exchange resin collectors at these stations so that we can cross-calibrate between what traditional instrumented monitoring is telling us and what the more passive techniques are telling us. In the early 2000s, recalling that the team objective also includes traditional resources and traditional resource uses of those resources, a berry quality study was initiated in collaboration with the Fort Mackay First Nation. This is ongoing, and we expect the results to be released in the coming year or two. Source apportionment is a relatively new venture for the TEEM committee. What this is actually looking at the deposition of substances at a location and trying to backtrack from that to what source is contributing what percentage of what element to the deposition at that location. This helps us understand the contributions from the different kinds of emission sources that we have in the region: tall stacks, mobile fleets, dust from roads, and so on. And again, Dr. Landis will be walking us through that in some detail. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Munkittrick, who will walk us through the process of analysis and publication of these results.
My name is Kelly Munkittrick. I'm a professor at Wilfred Laurier University in Waterloo. My background's in designing environmental monitoring programs. And previously I'd been a guest editor for special issues of other journals related to environmental monitoring. And so WBEA approached me and asked me if I would oversee the special issue and the publication of this series of papers. So a series of papers were generated by the scientists that tried to integrate the data across the components. And what we're trying to do when we publish the information is translate that information to make it more available to a scientific audience. It's necessary to use other strategies to get information out to policymakers and to industry and to the public, and the purpose of this meeting tonight is to get this information out to the public. But really there's a lot of effort around trying to make the information that comes out of here available in a way that creates action in response to it. And I'll talk a little bit about peer review in terms of publishing it. In the process of peer review, you send the articles out to scientists who are experts in the field in other areas that are unrelated to your study, and they provide feedback in terms of how they feel the study and the presentation of the information can be improved. So it's a process to try and get other scientists that use the methods that you use to make sure that the process you went through is acceptable in a scientific system. And peer review is far from a perfect system, but it does improve the quality of the information. So there's a number of other strategies you can use to get information out. The last time a synthesis of the air quality work that WBEA does was undertaken was published in a book. A book's a very satisfying way to publish information. It gives you an opportunity to really synthesize a lot of information together. One of the challenges is it doesn't get into the scientific literature as much. It's not accessible through a lot of the common search engines that scientists do. And because the methods that are being used here are comprehensive and the information is very comprehensive, there's a desire to get this information out and accessible to the scientific community. The middle one is an example of just a report that's generated by WBEA, and on the right side is a fact sheet. And so in addition to these ways, there was the intent to do this virtual special issue. Something about scientific journals for people who haven't published in that theater before. The Institute for Scientific Information has a process where they track high-quality journals. They currently track about 14,000 different scientific journals, and to get recognized in the search indices that scientists use when they're trying to find relevant information, you have to be in one of these ISI recognized journals. And to be a recognized journal, the journal has to meet certain publishing standards and timeliness and standard of the editorial board and a bunch of other criteria. So when you're looking for a journal to publish in, you can search and get rankings in terms of the recognition of journals. And the most common form of recognition is how often the articles in that journal are cited by other authors in other highly ranked journals. And academics and government scientists advance based on the number of publications and the quality and the impact of those. That impact can be really difficult to measure. But in an academic sense, the number of citations gives information on how useful others have found the work that you're doing. So something about the journal that was picked, it's called Science of the Total Environment. It's published weekly out of the Netherlands. It's been around since 1972. ISI recognizes 160 journals globally that work on pollution. Stoughton, which is the abbreviation for it, is ranked number 11 in the world. That citation score, if I can figure out how to use the arrow, which is never certain. This is a citation score from 1999 up to current, showing that the recognition of the journal is on a steady pace of increase. And this citation score means that the average paper in the journal gets cited about 5 times in the first 2 years after it's published. And so that's a fairly high ranking for a journal. And this is ranking of these 160 journals. This green color by year here just means that for environmental chemistry, environmental engineering, pollution, and waste management, this journal is recognized as being a very high quality journal. So this journal was picked. Virtual special issues are relatively new. It used to be, when I was involved with a couple previous special issues, you had papers submitted by various authors, and the tracking and publication of it could only proceed as fast as the slowest article. And what they've done now with virtual special issues, it's an online grouping of those articles when they're all available. But as the articles are submitted and go through the review process, they come out and are published as part of the regular scientific stream. Once the set of articles is complete, they're virtually bound together and made available online as a special issue. And so that's the process that we've gone through for this process. So just some details. What we do when we do this, we also open the call in the special issue globally to any papers that are working on similar issues. So this is just the wording of the call that went out. And we did get some papers we're not going to be talking about today that came in from other groups not affiliated with WBEA that went through the process. But what it was asking for was submissions which could contribute to the discussion in terms of methods to detect impacts from atmospheric deposition on regional terrestrial ecosystems, models for stakeholder engagement and oversight for designing comprehensive regional monitoring programs, supporting ongoing development of regulatory guidance and policy for management of cumulative effects from atmospheric deposition, and research into physical, chemical, and biological processes that advance the understanding of the mechanisms of transport, dispersion, and deposition, and consequent environmental effects. This is a peer review process. Again, what happens is you send it out internationally to people working in similar areas, and it can be quite I wouldn't say soul crushing, but it can be an impactful process where It's a blind process, so the authors don't know who the reviewers are, but generally it comes back with a lot of criticism and ways in which to improve the manuscript. And so on the left here is just a summary of the reviews that came back. They can come back and say accepted, accepted with minor changes, accepted with major changes, or rejection. And you can see that about 3/4 of the reviews that came back had fairly significant criticism of the work. And so then it goes back to the authors. They redo the analysis, they redo the presentation of the data, they take the criticism into consideration, and then it comes back and goes back out for review again a second time. The one on the right just is a breakdown by country. The articles went out to more than 25 different countries, to senior scientists working in this area to review the process. So the articles, first ones came in November of 18. All of them had to be into the system by the middle of March of this year. Most of them are out now. There's a couple that are in the final stages of review and resubmission after dealing with the external reviews. So we're expecting right now the special virtual issue to be fully available in September. Those articles that have completed the process are online and available now. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Landis to talk about the kinds of results that are in there.
Thank you, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. You've been sitting a while. If you need to get up, move around. There you go. Feel free. So tonight I've been tasked with going through and trying to present some of the findings from the 9 different publications that you just heard about. So I'm going to do my best to work through all of the different projects from all the different science teams. But first I want to go back to our conceptual model. I like pictures better, so my conceptual model is a picture. But you know what we've been talking about is emission sources, and some of them are point sources, some of them are mobile line sources, some of them are area sources, right? So all these things go into the atmosphere. They're transported and then redeposited. Even my little kids know if you throw something up in the air, eventually it's going to come back down. But it might not come back down the same way it went up, right? So you have photochemistry going on, you have transformations, and that deposition back to the surrounding environment here can either be wet deposition, that is in rain or snow, or dry deposition of particles or gases. We talk a lot about acidifying compounds. Once those things get into the ecosystem, there's possibilities for changes in soil nutrient cycling, decreased plant biodiversity, and lake and stream acidification and eutrophication. So these are all the things that the different study teams work through. So we're going to try to linearly go through our conceptual model. So the first paper that came out talked about ambient concentrations and estimating deposition. Estimating deposition is important when you're looking at forest health because that's really your exposure metric. How much material A was the ecosystem exposed to? These estimates were based on the active monitoring sites, the AMS sites, as well as the passive tower sites that you've heard about. And so as part of this paper, they went through these various years and estimated deposition fields to the forest. You see the fields get larger as we go on, as more and more sites are added to the network and we have more certainty. In general, we saw SO2 exhibiting this strong spatial gradient, which you can see in these later years. And that in general, SO2 decreased in time by approximately 40% since 2000. So we should be expecting a downward trend in deposition. When we looked at ambient NO2, the same exercise, we did the same exercise looking at calculating the multi-year deposition or exposure metric variables. Again, we saw strong spatial gradients across the region. We saw this increase from 2000 to 2008, and then it sort of either plateaued or declined a little bit. And we saw some weaker gradients for some of these other compounds, the nitric acid, ammonia, and PM2.5. The other thing we found out is that the wildfires are a significant source of ammonia. In general, these boreal forest systems are nitrogen deficient. So any nitrogen that presents itself quickly gets absorbed into the vegetation. In addition to the gas phase components, the ambient monitoring stations also measure particulate matter, we call PM, in various size ranges. The important size range for deposition here is this we'll call coarse particles, or PM2.5. These are larger particles. They have more higher density. They deposit very rapidly. And so when they looked at these samples and they analyzed them, they found out in general these coarse particles are more alkaline. That means there's more cations than anions. They're strongly seasonal, which makes sense. Here's an example of the seasonality of calcium. The major source here is limestone, quarrying and crushing and using for haul roads. So that occurs mostly during the summer, and I think a lot of those facilities are actually closed down during the winter. The deposition of this PM10 coarse matter, which typically occurs in fugitive dust, since they are strongly alkaline, it reduces the overall impact of the acidic species. So there's a lot on this slide, but when we're looking at deposition of acidic compounds, there's a lot of different compounds that are taken into account, right? The dry deposition as well as bulk deposition. Dry deposition estimates are calculated based on ambient concentrations. And then, of course, the bulk deposition are measured using the IERs that Ken talked about. We saw some patterns emerging in terms of the sites that are closer to the surface operations, where the bulk deposition of ammonium and NO2 are more important, and some of the other compounds are more important as you get further away from, and as the fugitive dust loads decrease. So then the other thing is you can start looking at spatial patterns. We sort of saw that in the interpolated plots in the first couple slides, but you can really see it when you plot the concentration of, for example, calcium as a function of distance to the near surface operation. You see very high deposition in these close sites. We have this sort of transitional zone, and then by the time you get to 50 kilometers out, it's more of like back to a regional background. Same with the particulate ammonium and some of the gas phase species, and particulate sulfate as well. So in general, we see, again, higher concentrations up to a factor of 2-3 higher, closer to the operations, decreasing to background as you go further out. So when you take all those individual components of anions and cations, and you can calculate this potential acid input, PAI. And when you look at that spatially, you can see areas close to these surface mining operations have high sulfur and nitrogen deposition, that's those acidifying compounds, as well as high deposition of the base cations, or those alkaline particles. As you get further away, you still have some of the high base cations in certain areas, and then the lower sulfur and nitrogen. So in these areas, you could potentially get some acidification. In these areas, you're actually getting some alkalization. In general, you can see that the range goes from negative alkalization up to some areas where you do have some acidification in the region. So moving on to a different paper, now we're going to talk a little bit about lichens, and Ken alluded to this a little bit earlier. Lichens are actually kind of unique. As a biomonitor, they're fairly ubiquitous in the region. They're tolerant to a lot of air pollution, including SO2, and they're effective accumulators of some of the compounds we're interested in, like sulfur, nitrogen, trace metals, and even organic compounds such as PEHs. And they're there already. They're in situ. And so you can go out in a very cost-effective way every few years and just collect these things that are growing out there anyway. In areas where we can't do active monitoring because of limitations in access and power. And the thing that's unique about epiphytic lichens, these are lichens that grow in trees, is that they receive all their nutrients from atmospheric deposition. And that the uptake can occur over their entire body surface. They don't have cuticles, and so this is all unrestricted. And so they accumulate things way in excess, for example, of their metabolic needs. So what that means for us is on this every 6-year schedule, we can ride out to some of these remote sites, manually collect these lichens. The protocol that they were using is they weren't just collecting a few individuals, they were taking a composite sample of a lot of individuals, from a minimum of 10 trees within these forest stands, both from the forest health monitoring sites and some additional monitoring sites. Those samples have to be brought back to the lab and meticulously cleaned. You have to remove all the other species, bark, twigs, and all the other kinds of things. After that, they're ground and homogenized into a fine dust. Those samples are then sent out to analytical laboratories where they're extracted, sorry, there's a little delay here, where they're extracted and analyzed for a series of inorganic and organic compounds. Once you have all those results back from the lab, you can make some pretty interesting inferences from them. So first, I want to talk about some of the forest health monitoring sites that Ken had talked about. I'm going to focus on site 1004, which is a near source site, as well as site 2001, which is a further away site. This map also just gives you an idea of how the surface footprint of some of the operations have changed over time from 2002 through 2017. That spans the time period where the lichens that we collected. On the right side here were the 2 comprehensive collection years, right? So we did it in 2008 and 2014. Large numbers of sites over the entire region using that same 150 to 200 kilometer radius around the center of oil sands operation. So what can we learn from that? Well, the first thing we did is we looked at those site-specific samples that we had took. These are repeated visits to that same forest health monitoring site over and over and over. And again, this is that near source site, 1004. We have total sulfur here measured as total percent. We see this trend from 2004 through 2017 increasing significantly. Nitrogen, we saw no significant increase or decrease for that matter. Then we have aluminum, which is a great tracer for just soil or background dust. And vanadium, which is a good petrogenic tracer for oil sand material. Significant increases at the close-up site. We look at our sort of more remote or distal location. We see no change in sulfur, significant change. We see a slight significant change in nitrogen, likewise with aluminum, and no change in vanadium. So again, the theme is when you're getting closer to these surface operations, we're seeing more significant and larger changes over time. And of course, for this analysis, we're limited to just those sites that are repeatedly sampled. If we wanted to get a larger regional scale appreciation for what's happening, we can go back to these comprehensive sampling years data. Again, 2008 and 2014. And we can look at, in this example is vanadium. Again, this is that petrogenic element that's a good tracer for oil sand material. And you can interpolate all the sites that we had sampled each year. You can sort of get a sense for the footprint and the regional size of the impact from 2008, 2014. Then we could build a spatial model, estimate those what we call a zonal mean concentration in a gridded framework from both 2008, 2014. And then we could subtract one for the other and test for significance of the change. And so using the example of vanadium, mostly increased over the domain, but only these areas that have the percent increase in them were statistically significant. So using these lichens, we can evaluate very large spatial scales and then sort of hone in on where are areas where deposition is increasing. When we look at some of the other compounds, we see sulfur. We saw a significant increase in every grid cell in the entire region. Nitrogen, we saw a single grid cell that had a significant decrease. And then you can start looking at iron and aluminum, again, are good tracers for regional background soil or surface disturbance. Fugitive dust, we see increases in the Central Valley around a lot of these operations. And then calcium and strontium are good tracers for that limestone sort of thing. And we actually saw decreases in strontium and an increase in only one grid cell for calcium. So you can sort of see source-specific change in some of these tracer species. So then we can go back and can talk about source apportionment. This is a modeling framework where we can go back and retrospectively look at data that was collected and estimate what the sources were. And it's not just a model, right? We always like to say it's a modeling approach. So you need to design your sampling in such a way, your analytical methodologies in such a way, and run your modeling in such a way that everything fits together and is complementary. So the first thing we did was work with WBEA and other contractors to develop local source profiles. This is like the fingerprint of a specific source. A lot of these sources have very unique ratios of emissions of certain elements. And then we did both ambient monitoring in Fort McKay from time period for 2 years, one 2010 to 2011, and again in 2014 to 15. And then did both of the comprehensive lichen monitoring episodes. And source apportionment modeling gives you two interesting things. The first is we can go back and say, and this is an example, I believe, of 2014 lichen collection. You can say, hey, what are the sources of some of these trace elements that we're interested in, including the calcium and some of these base cations? Well, the model will go through, take what you know about the sources and the chemical signatures of the sources versus the chemical enhancements in the lichen material, and we can model what the sources contributing to what we observed were. And you can see a lot of these sources for the inorganic components are all fugitive dust based, from raw oil sand to haul road dust and petroleum coke dust, for example, and some mobile sources. And then we looked at trying to explain the sources of organic compounds. And in this case, you know, petroleum coke fugitive dust and oil sand fugitive dust, again, are large sources. So this gives you, as Kelly mentioned, actionable information. You can see the increases happening over time. We can go back and figure out what the sources that are responsible for those increases are. When you look at the ambient time series, the other interesting thing you can get from the source apportionment model is temporal change. And so you get the same sort of information on the sources and what percentages they contribute, and then you can look at things over time. I always like to look at biomass combustion. And again, this is 2014-15. There was some wildfire activity that summer, in the summer. And then you have periods where we don't see a whole lot of influence. And then we see it here in the winter, which we can attribute to using wood for home heating, for example. So there's a lot of information that can be garnered from this type of approach. Then we move to the next step in our conceptual model. And we start, taking these atmospheric deposition fields that the atmospheric team developed using those ambient and the passive tower monitoring data. And they say, how does the deposition compare to foliar concentrations as well as soil concentrations through the soil profile? And you can see in this plot right here for sulfur, see if I can get this to go. We saw there was a significant relationship between atmospheric deposition and foliar sulfate concentration, or total sulfur concentration. There was a significant association between deposition and that top soil surface layer, as well as the surface layer from 5 to 15 centimeters. So we can estimate the atmospheric deposition and actually see increases in foliar concentration as well as soil concentrations for sulfur. For nitrogen, interestingly, atmospheric deposition is positively associated with the foliar concentrations again, but was not significantly correlated to any of the soil strata. Again, these boreal forests are nitrogen deficient in general, and so these trees really suck that atmospheric deposition up, and then it really doesn't appear to even make it to the ground. Then we had another group that again looked at those deposition fields and tried to evaluate the impact of atmospheric deposition on the jack pine stands. And the criteria they looked at was what they call basal area increment. That's basically the radial growth of the tree, how fast the tree was growing. And they looked at various periods, the pre-mining period versus this 2001 to 2010 period. And they also looked at understory vegetation, the shrubs, the forbs, the grasses, the biophytes, the lichens. And they looked at cover, species richness, diversity, and composition. Really looking at the total community health. Do we see impacts of that deposition on these endpoints? Basically what they found in the jack pine trees is that the productivity of the forest actually increased with increased deposition of nitrogen, sulfur, and base cations. And that area where the mining took place actually had a higher BAI prior to the mining area compared to the current period. When they looked at the understory vegetation, they found that vascular plants, cover, richness, and diversity increased again, related to the amount of nitrogen and sulfur deposition. So their key conclusions were that atmospheric deposition was not detrimental to tree health or understory vegetation. And in fact, they hypothesized that it has a fertilization effect, possibly due to the enhanced deposition of the nitrogen compounds.
Thanks, Matt, for this really, really good overview of everything that we found in this virtual special issue. It was an incredible amount of work, and it really culminates on the heels of 20 years of really incredible work by a lot of people in this region and responding to a lot of concerns about people who live in this region. So it's been pretty fantastic to see it all come together. So I just want to kind of take the 30,000 foot view of what it is that we've achieved here and what these articles say. So in essence, over the last 20 odd years, there have been 4 major forest health campaigns that included soil and needle chemistry and tree growth and understory plant communities. There have been 2 major lichen collections, a yearly tree condition survey, and the deposition and ambient air measures have been going yearly, changed out monthly for passives and biannually for the ion exchange resins. And that's a lot of work. This has all been co-located so that we can very explicitly test what's the relationship between atmospheric deposition and the effects that we see on the receiving environment. And when it comes to establishing a monitoring program that is responsive and can answer a clear question, it's very useful to think about what is it that we might see in the environment, how might that change, and what are we going to do about it. So for what you can see down here, for example, from a conceptual point of view, when you're monitoring, it's very easy to monitor stressors going into the environment, to measure the chemicals going out. They change quickly and they're very reversible. As you go, as things become more complicated, you can start looking at the effects in the receiving environment. So what's the chemistry of the soil and water that's in the receiving environment? Again, this takes a little bit longer to manifest and it's a little bit harder to reverse. As organisms start to respond, you'll start to see things as a biochemical response, and then that will eventually affect the organism health. And every step along here, you have to make trade-offs. And those trade-offs are cost and expense. How long does it take before I can expect to see an effect? How reversible is that effect? And we can spend a lot of time measuring down here, but then you get into the question, we're measuring a lot of things going into the environment. What's meaningful? I can find almost any analytical test that will find a difference between 2 sites, but is that meaningful for the environment? It's hard to say. It's also hard to say from just measuring all of the stressors going into the environment to predict what those effects might be. So an effective monitoring program will have a range of indicators along this pathway so that you can start to make these linkages between cause and effect. And in essence, that's how the TEEM program was designed. So we have the stressor being the deposition variables, then measures of soil chemistry, lichen chemistry, and foliar chemistry, lichen community, and the understory community and tree growth. Ken showed this at the beginning of the evening. This was the conceptual model that has driven the program. So as you said before, acid deposition was originally considered to be the big driver of effects in the forest and the big concern. I'd like to note also that these original concerns were largely driven by local Aboriginal communities who were concerned about what they thought what they were seeing in the forest and what the potential was for deposition on forest health. So to summarize, what have we found after all this? And it's actually been a very, very interesting story. We are seeing deposition of nitrogen and sulfur compounds, and we are seeing them at higher concentrations closer to the mineable region. But what we didn't expect is that the effects of this is balanced by a concurrent deposition of dust, which is alkaline. So as a result, we're not seeing a lot of effects of acid deposition. Now, if we'd been monitoring just what was being deposited, that might be the end of the story. But the concern now becomes, what's the potential effect on the environment? This is another way of looking at all of the monitoring locations. Each one of these dots is a forest health site, and the color of it corresponds with what the potential acid input is. And according to the existing acid deposition management framework, the critical load is 0.25 kilo equivalents per hectare per year of acid deposition. These sites are seeing deposition of that range, but there's more modeling and work that has to be done to look at the soil sensitivities to determine whether this is actually exceeding a critical load. But the interesting thing is that as our conversations and understanding about the soils around this region improve, now there's discussion about what should this threshold be. And so the existing threshold for targeting more monitoring is 0.7, and we can see that if we use that, 0.17, pardon me. You see that if we use that threshold, then there's more sites that become areas that we might want to trigger in more monitoring. And over here, these are the sites that are getting much more basin deposition than acidic deposition. So it's a difficult question to say, okay, we're seeing all of this deposition happening in the environment. What does that mean? And that's the role of doing the forest health and doing the effects-based monitoring. And so the interesting thing is that in doing this, we found something that was a bit unexpected, and that's the role of dust in this area. If you live here, I'm sure you know that dust can be a big concern around the mineable area. So here's some different pictures of dust clouds. This is actually dust blowing off a petcoke pile. Here's some dust from operations seen from the air, and then just a generalized kind of dusty haze over the region. And this has been an underappreciated input into the system, and it's very hard to model. We're going to talk a little bit in a bit about why that's important. It's what's supplying the base cations to the system that's neutralizing the acidic input, and it also provides varying concentrations of different metals and organic compounds called PAHs that are of concern. So the question becomes, there's been some talk about dust control in the region to address some of these issues. If that happens, what happens with our acidic input? And we might find that we might start seeing more effects from acid deposition than what we're seeing right now. I also like to point out that as the industry matures and more in situ projects come online, because these areas are, these are in situ projects, once the construction is over, that input of dust goes down, and so we might expect to see different effects in those areas. But so we'll look a little bit at summarize some of the source apportionment results that Matt spoke to. So combined, the articles in the special issue address a number of different compounds. So we had trace elements, base cations, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, nitrogen, and sulfur compounds. We could trace back their source, as Matt said, to different operations. So some trace elements are arriving by long-range transport, so this means overseas high-altitude transport. Some are being emitted by stacks. A lot of the dust is coming from haul roads, quarrying operations. We're having petcoke and raw oil sand are giving contributions of PACs and organic compounds and sulfur. The mine fleets and transport are a big vector for providing nitrogen compounds, and forest fires, of course, provide a lot of base cations, PACs, and also nitrogen compounds, and a lot of dust in and of themselves. Now we can start linking that to what are we seeing in the receiving environment. So we saw effects on lichen chemistry, as Matt said. We also saw that there was dust impacts to berries. There was changes to soil chemistry and needle chemistry, but the really interesting thing is the effects to understory vegetation. So we saw that there was an effect on understory vegetation, but it wasn't via acidic deposition as originally hypothesized. It was via eutrophication. And this was unexpected when the program was originally designed, but it speaks to the power of having effects-based modeling as part of your, or monitoring as part of your monitoring program, because we were able to detect these changes. So what does that mean for TEEM going forward? It means that now we have to do a bit more work thinking about what's going on here and adapt our conceptual model. And this is the hallmark of a good monitoring program also, is that it should be able to adapt as more information is coming in. So now that we understand a little bit better that eutrophication is a pathway, can we add more boxes and arrows to this already very pretty diagram? Although I will admit, Matt, I think yours is prettier because it does have pictures. So now we've got a second potential class of stressors, which is eutrophication. And so each one of these arrows shows a potential pathway of effect. The ones that are bold are pathways of effect that were demonstrated in articles coming out of the virtual special issue. So again, we did see evidence that eutrophication was affecting soil chemistry and needle chemistry, that it was affecting understory vegetation. And then the evidence around tree health is a little bit more tenuous. And then paired with the power of source apportionment models, so we can then go back and say, what does this mean from a management perspective? Where are these compounds coming from? And again, we can start filling out what's happening on the left side of this conceptual model. So what's the take home from this? There's a lot of value in the work that WBEA has done over the last 20 years. The timescales are important, as Kelly pointed out, that there is an immense value in data sets of this time length, especially because a lot of these impacts do take a number of years to manifest themselves. The changes that we saw in the environment were unanticipated in the beginning. And there's the two flip sides to the coin of understanding what's going on in the environment is, what do I see versus monitoring, and what do I think is actually happening and why? And that's the modeling part. And so a good monitoring program should be working in concert with very strong models that test our assumptions about what we think is going on. So our next steps are going to be working with models that are operating in this area and starting to reconcile some of the differences that we are seeing. And we are seeing differences. So the modeling is predicting changes that we haven't seen in the receiving environment. So now we're going to go back with those groups and say, what are we, where do we go from here, and how do we understand things a bit better? So what next? Now that we've done this really Herculean task of pulling together all of the data over the last year and a half, and I can't emphasize enough just how much the data management, what a challenge it is, and what a good job everyone has done of that. Now that we have a better understanding of what's going, now we can take that and say, can we improve the program? So because now we've changed our conceptual model about what's happening in the environment, does that mean should we go back, look at what we're looking at, see if we need to look at anything else? Do we need to look in other places? That sort of thing. And as we all know, there's a lot of other monitoring going on in the oil sands region, and a lot of these programs are starting to mature to the point where it's really time that we start integrating with what other groups are seeing going on in the environment, and starting to ask questions about, if we're seeing, say, deposition here in forests, what's happening in wetlands? Who's doing that work? Who can we work with? How does this affect biodiversity? Who's doing that work, and how can we work with them? Who's doing modeling that does the predictive work from what the emissions are? What does that say, and how can we work with them? And that's going to be the coming challenge of the next few years, and it'll be a lot of work. And most importantly, it's time overdue, probably, to start looking at how can we better include Indigenous perspectives. So as I said in the beginning, this program was originally initiated because of Indigenous concerns about the forest. And it's time now for us to go back to the communities and really have those conversations about what are the communities seeing on the landscape, what are they seeing in the forests. What does a healthy forest mean from the Indigenous perspective? Are there things that we can be looking at from that perspective that we might have missed? And with that, I'll pass it back to Dr. Munkittrick.
Great down here. Again, my background's in environmental monitoring. I'm not an air person. And this is a book that came out of Australia a few years ago that talks about effective ecological monitoring. It criticized a large number of programs around the world and identified some of the key challenges for monitoring programs: poor articulation of questions, inappropriate design, challenges with the time scale and the long data sets needed, competition for resources in terms of being able to continue the monitoring, and just the absence of long-term data. And WBEA has done a great job of avoiding these pitfalls that a lot of monitoring programs have seen. This is an article that came out a little over, almost 2 years ago now. And it talks about long-term data sets in ecological journals. And what it shows is the time scale on the left axis and the percentile of studies. And what it says is that studies that are of the same duration as the WBEA studies have been are really, really rare in the literature. So it's a really important set of studies. It's really important that WBEA has been able to maintain this program for so long. This is another recent article that talks about the fact that long-term studies contribute disproportionately to ecology and policy. When people are trying to make management decisions, these long-term data sets that are very rare have a very strong role in making important decisions. So they're essential for characterizing how and why nature is changing, understanding the regulation and functioning of ecosystems, linking patterns to environmental variability, and informing management and policy responses. So again, the work that WBEA is doing is very rare and very important, and they've done a good job of pulling it together. One of the areas that we're working on in my research program is around how to design tiered and triggered adaptive programs. So monitoring has a number of different tiers: surveillance tiers, confirmation, extended magnitude, and investigation of cause, investigation of solutions. And there's 3 different philosophies that you can have: stressor-based, values-based, and effects-based. And people talked here tonight about the importance of having this effects-based component, because it can go out and the organisms out there, in this case the plants and the lichens and the understory, integrate the signals that they're receiving from the environment. And even though you set out thinking one thing's happening, the organisms can tell you that something's happening that was unexpected. So these effects-based approaches are very important, as well as all of the stressor-based monitoring that goes on through WBEA. And Carla just touched on the importance of going back to the local communities now and making sure that you're representing and interpreting properly what the concerns are. Need to develop monitoring triggers to supplement LARP management triggers. The LARP Air Quality Framework has a series of triggers in it. There aren't effects-based triggers in terms of the kinds of monitoring that's been going on in this program. Enhanced monitoring means enhanced abilities to detect change, and with sufficient effort, change can be detected that's both sustainable and acceptable. Going out and seeing some of these small changes and important changes that are being seen in terms of early responses, once you know what to track, you can do a much better job of following changes over time. And detecting change is critical for management. And developing these kinds of monitoring triggers are very important for focusing effort where concern is the highest. The analysis that's gone on as part of this effort now allows people to step back and look at where should monitoring be increased, where can it be reduced, and how can it be focused in a way to try and give some more information on what's going on. Having this link between the effects and the stressors is really important. The periodic monitoring of key effects, it's really logistically challenging, but it's really important to verify that the understanding they have is correct. You need to step back and ask if the monitoring system's giving you value. As Carla mentioned, with the new model, you got to step back and check whether your original objectives have changed. Was your conceptual model different? Are you still answering the questions that you set out for, and are there any new questions that you need to consider? So programs need to be adapted and focused based on new information, but it needs to be done in a way that ensures consistency and retains the value of the data. So it has to be a really thoughtful, strategic process. And you need to make sure that you have the opportunity to focus resources where concern's the highest. And part of that involves using these triggers to turn off and on stations based on the level of concern. So what is the role of a program like this forest health one in larger management issues? A regional effects framework should build consistency in monitoring programs, place them into a regional framework, should explicitly incorporate research design, scientific data analysis, and effect quantification into monitoring programs, should quantify thresholds for environmental stress, enable incorporation of effects-based information into stressor-based approaches, and link environmental assessment to environmental management and planning. And I think you've seen tonight that WBEA has done a really good job of these objectives. So some of the insights and needs from a broader perspective is to build a scientific framework that provides regular information. Need to take another look at this conceptual model and the hypotheses that are being tested. Get a good understanding of natural variability in the system drivers. When you get data gaps that you detect when these kinds of analyses, if you don't get the resources to look at them, there's an opportunity that's lost. So long-term strategic plans are needed. And potential new components need to be considered in terms of the potential impact on the overall plan. As I mentioned, you don't want to lose the value from the long-term data and the sampling that goes on there. You need to have a fully integrated program across and within elements and mechanisms to allow you to adapt to changing priorities and agendas. WBEA has done a really good job of standardized protocols and in developing the ability to understand the extent and magnitude of real ecosystem responses in terms of stressors and impacts. So monitoring needs to be able to identify the magnitude and extent of change, how it's changing over time, and whether it's related and can be associated with oil sands activities and effects on the receptors. So future needs, Carla touched on briefly. There's a lot of other work that's going on within the oil sands monitoring program. There needs to be a lot more effort to integrate across the monitoring programs, across the organizations, and across the monitoring entities. The amount of work that WBEA had to put in to get all of this data into a single place where it could all be used by the different groups was really enormous. That needs to be done on a much broader scale within oil sands monitoring. You really need a larger integrated database to improve modeling capabilities. A lot of modeling is going on in oil sands monitoring that's making a lot of predictions. There needs to be on-the-ground testing to try and verify and validate those predictions. There's a need for consistent guidance and methods so that broader data can be combined. Need to really focus on developing the capacity for predicting on a site-specific, local, and regional basis to allow monitoring to transition from a retrospective situation where you're looking at what has already happened to predictive assessments of what might happen. And the big one is that modeling, management, and monitoring need to be tied together in a system that provides feedback to improve decision making, and in a way that the monitoring gets improved by the modeling gets improved by the monitoring. That's not too many M's. And that they both are tied into management decisions in a way that's more effective. So I think I'll invite the other speakers up on stage here, and we'll open up to some questions from the audience if there are any. But I would like to thank people for your attention and sitting through this series of presentations.